Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sanjay, and in this video I'm going to try and introduce this whole idea of unhedged ETFs and what the whole idea of currency fluctuations is. And I'm going to use an analogy which you should be familiar with if you've done some traveling overseas and you've had to deal with multiple currencies. And I'm also going to introduce a diagram to you which I haven't seen anyone else use to try and make the whole idea of currency fluctuations and ETF returns easier to digest and easier to interpret. And you can see when different ETFs are doing different things, and you can see where it fits into this diagram. And hopefully that will give you a bit more of a firmer grasp of what's going on in the world of currency fluctuations when it comes to ETF returns. So this topic generally doesn't come up when you start investing in ETFs because most people will start domestically. They will start with investing in their own country, in their own currency. So if you're in Australia, you'll invest in like a A200, a VAS, one of iShares or a VanEck product or something like that, where you only have to deal with the Australian dollar. Then at some point you've probably watched some video or you see some Instagram post about the importance of investing internationally. You don't want to have this home currency issue or home bias issue. So you start looking at international investing with maybe a VGS product, an IVV, some kind of S&P tracker, whatever it is. And you're faced with this conversation around hedged versus unhedged. Should you try and manage your currency risk, or should you let currency fluctuations work in your favor and you're not really sure which one? And most people will look at the cheaper one and they'll say, I'll just go with the cheaper one and let it be. Or they'll do a bit of Googling, find a Reddit article or something in there where it says it doesn't really matter in the long run. And it's true. Pretty sure it doesn't really matter in the long run. It all ends up balancing out. But it still helps to understand what's actually going on when it comes to currency fluctuations. And there was this lovely post from the legendary Ray Dalio on his Instagram account where he said most people don't really understand currency fluctuations, and it is important to understand it, especially from a diversification point of view. So in this video, I'm going to give you that analogy, give you that diagram, and hopefully coming out of the video, you'll have a much better understanding, especially to the point where you can then explain it to other people, and that's when you really know you get it. And I think this will really help you with your ETF investing strategy. So let's get into it. So let's start with the familiar topic of transferring your domestic currency into an international currency when you have to travel overseas. So as someone who lives in Australia, let's say if I want to travel to the US, I need to convert my Australian dollars into US dollars. Something you'd all be familiar with, you convert 1,000 Australian dollars and let's say you get 750 US dollars. Let's say I went to the US, I then spent some time over there and I didn't actually spend this money. Unrealistic, but let's say it did happen. And then when I came back to Australia, I tried to convert my US dollars into Australian dollars. And if the US dollar got stronger against the Australian dollar, another way of putting that is the Australian dollar got weaker against the US, then that $750 US will probably get me more Australian dollars when I convert it across. Now, the opposite can also happen where, say, the Australian dollar gets stronger against the US, my 750 US dollars gets me less in terms of Australian dollars. I get less than $1,000 back. And that's purely because of currency fluctuation. So I didn't spend any of my US dollars, but purely because either the Australian dollar got stronger or weaker against the US dollar, I ended up with more or less money when I converted it across. So this is this whole currency fluctuation thing, which most people will be familiar with when you have to travel. Now, when you combine that with the whole idea of investing overseas with ETFs or even just individual shares, but we'll stick to ETFs, this can also be a bit complicated because you have to consider both the fluctuations of the ETF, so the underlying holdings of the companies you're investing in, along with the currency fluctuations of the international currency against your domestic currency. So taking that idea of transferring between currencies and combining it with investing in ETFs, that's where I thought this diagram would actually help you bring the two together. And the idea is on the y-axis, going up and down, you have your returns from your ETFs. Did your ETF returns go up or did they go down against some relative period previously? Then on the x-axis, we introduce the idea of what's going on with the currency that you're invested in internationally against your domestic currency. How did your currency fluctuate? So in this example, let's use the Australian dollar against the US dollar. How did it move relative to each other in terms of against the previous time period. So with the diagram, you can now see you have 4 quadrants. You have the top right, where you've got situations where the ETF is performing positively and the currency has moved in, let's say, a strengthening fashion, where it's really the international currency has gotten stronger against the domestic currency, and that's a good thing. It's a favorable thing. Then on the other extreme, on the bottom left, you've got situations where your ETF has underperformed or it's performed poorly, and the currency has moved in a way where it's actually been negative to you. It's usually when your domestic currency performs well against the international currency and it ends up being a negative event. So you've got these 2 extremes, and then on the other 2 extremes, you've got where your ETF performs poorly, but the currency moves in a favorable way. And on the other side, you've got your ETF performs well, but the currency moves in an unfavorable way. Now you should be able to visualize using this that between, say, 2 periods of time, your investments would end up in one of these 4 quadrants where your ETF has performed well and also your currency has done something. This is what unhedged investing basically opens you up to, is not only the movements of the ETF itself, but also the movements of your currency against your international currency. So this is now apparent when we look at VGS against VGAD in certain situations like COVID or just after COVID. So when COVID happened, we had this situation where the international ETF went down. Basically, all international markets went down. However, what also happened was the Australian dollar got weaker against the US dollar, or more accurately, the US dollar got stronger against the Australian dollar. Usually in times of international uncertainty, the US dollar is considered like this currency, this reserve currency. Well, it is the reserve currency, and everyone kind of flocks to it, and the demand for it goes up, and all other currencies get weaker against it. So what you see is you get this situation where you'll get the bottom right quadrant where your ETF performs poorly, but your currency performs in a favorable way. And you end up having this kind of cushioning effect where the movements of the ETF are cushioned by favorable movements of your currency. And I'll throw up a diagram now where you can see VGS against VGAD, and over that COVID time period, how VGS, the unhedged version, actually seems to have not done as poorly as VGAD, the hedged version, because it was cushioned out by the movements of the currency. Because theoretically, the ETF movements would have been the same, but the movement of the currency protected the downside event. Now, after the downward event in COVID, we had the recovery following COVID, and we had markets all performing really well. Now, we shifted from being in the bottom right quadrant to now being in the top left quadrant if you looked against 2 time periods. And you'll see where the ETF performed quite well. You had positive gains on the ETFs of VGS and VGAD, the underlying holdings where they're invested. However, because one of them was not hedged, the performance of the currency had an impact on its returns. And the performance of the currency being mainly the Australian dollar against the US dollar, where the Australian dollar got stronger against the US dollar. And you had this situation where now, even though VGS is doing quite well, just as well as VGAD, the currency movements are actually holding back its performance, because when you add but the ETF returns along with the currency fluctuation, it actually ends up with a lower result. And you'll see this period where VGAD outperformed VGS, and you'll see it as well with NDQ against HNDQ, where all the hedged ETFs outperformed their unhedged counterparts, and you have this top left quadrant. So this hopefully helps you visualize these situations where you have to consider both the currency movements along with what actually happened with the underlying ETF. Now, this diagram actually just represents unhedged situations where you have your ETF and your currency moving in ways that impact your returns. And all that happens when you introduce hedging, or you get a hedged ETF, you remove the x-axis basically, and you're removing that fluctuation, and you're just getting the vertical movements. You're just getting the returns of the underlying ETFs. That's it. So that's why they'll say we remove currency risk fluctuations. But sometimes currency risk can actually work out to your favor. You can be in situations like in the top right, where your ETF is performing well and your currency is moving in a favorable way, that you get these amplified gains. Or you can also be catastrophically screwed, like in the bottom left, where your ETF is performing poorly and the currency you're investing against gets weaker against a domestic currency and you just get amplified losses, as opposed to if you had just had a hedged ETF in that situation. So I've seen more of the top left and bottom right situations where you have them going in the opposite directions rather than them going in the same direction, but it can occur. And that's what this whole idea of currency fluctuations is. So hopefully with this diagram, you now have a better understanding of what hedged and unhedged is and this whole idea of currency fluctuations. And you also understand when you are getting a hedged product, you know what you're essentially doing is removing this x-axis movement and you're just getting the vertical movements of the underlying ETF. And you also understand that sometimes currency can work in your favor and at other times it can work against you. So if you want to check out any of my other videos, especially on VGS against VGAD, click up here. And if you want to see that video from Ben Felix where he does say, I think essentially it doesn't really matter which one you do go with, and probably better to go with the unhedged version, check out that video down here. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.